On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our first session of the day is what Lucretius taught us about pandemics. Stephen Greenblatt in conversation with Tom Holland. In his philosophical masterpiece On the Nature of Things, written around 50 BCE, Lucretius devoted particular attention to pandemics. Here, the Pulitzer Prize-winning professor of English at Harvard talks to writer, historian, and translator of Lucretius, Tom Holland, about what the Roman sage can tell us about the disease and lockdown. Stephen Greenblatt is the Kogan University professor of the humanities at Harvard. He is the author of 14 books, including Tyrant, Shakespeare, and Power, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, and Will in the World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare. His honors include the Holberg Prize, the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the Mellon Distinguished Humanist Award. Tom Holland is the author of a range of prize-winning books on ancient and medieval history. His most recent book, Dominion, tells the history of Christianity. He has presented a number of TV documentaries on topics ranging from dinosaurs to ISIS. As you all are aware, all our sessions are available to view on our Facebook page, JLF LitFest on Facebook, and Jaipur LitFest JLF on YouTube. In case you fall off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur LitFest JLF. And of course, if we fall off, just hang in there. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, what Lucretius taught us about pandemics. Stephen Greenblatt in conversation with Tom Holland.
Stephen, this is definitely a great time to be thinking about writers and their relationship to pandemic. But of course, Lucretius himself didn't actually, as far as we know, live through major bouts of plague. He was writing against a backdrop of the slow implosion of the Roman Republic into what would become, with Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, into civil war. So he is writing against a backdrop of crisis, although perhaps not specifically plague. What is Lucretius's response and suggestion to people how they should cope with periods of extreme stress and trauma?
This is a timely question, as we unfortunately know. And I think actually, to pick up the very first thing that you said, it's probably the case that the fact that Lucretius ends, as far as we know, his long philosophical poem with a very elaborate retelling of the plague in Athens from centuries before his own time, 430 before the Common Era. He's writing around 50 before the Common Era. It's very striking and, as you say, surprising. I've been thinking about why now, and the first thing to say is what you've already suggested, which is that, or implied, which is that Lucretius had, I think, considerable doubts about whether the idea of the city, of Rome, the grandeur of Rome, the impregnability of Rome, so forth, the world power that was Rome, all of the how should we say, Virgilian fantasies, where I think he had considerable skepticism about it. To an American, this feels very timely in any case, because I think the ending the poem the way he does, with a city basically in the grip of an uncontrollable epidemic, is a way of suggesting that the fantasies that were so prevalent in his time about the grandeur and the power of Rome were precisely that, fantasies. That all it would take would be a tiny swerve, molecular swerve, a tiny change, a mutation, as we would say, and everything could change. Everything would fall apart.
But for people watching who might be looking for something to cling on to, some source of hope or inspiration, does Lucretius offer any kind of advice on how to cope with these traumatic experiences?
He does. I mean, in effect, the whole poem is advice as to how to deal with it, but it's advice that basically is at odds, let's say, with the Rome first slogan, or whatever the equivalent was at the time. It was about fortifying your inner life. Not so much, I mean, certainly Lucretius believed that there was a scientific explanation for what was going on. He thought it was very important not to think that Zeus, Jupiter in this case, was punishing you, or Apollo, or that this was the result of the gods, and because of something you did. It's something in the natural world that's happening. But he thought the way of dealing with that, as with all crises of the body, was first and foremost to try to be strong, be calm internally, to how should we say, take a breath and fortify oneself spiritually, mentally, and that actually that was the medicine. His master, his philosophical master Lucretius, spoke about this as a kind of medicine that you could take in situations precisely like this, and it was the strongest way you could deal with what you couldn't control.
I mean, thinking about the Lucretius's account of the plague, which is derives from Thucydides' account of the plague, and both of them are horrible. The descriptions of the symptoms, and in a way, I mean, if there's anything to kind of clutch onto, it's that clearly the Athenian plague was vastly more infectious and vastly more unpleasant in its consequences even than COVID-19.
Although they sound rather similar in a curious way. They begin with fever. First of all, they thought it came from some faraway place, Egypt.
From Egypt, doesn't it? Creeps up.
And then it seems to cross over vast distances, be extremely contagious, as you say. And it started with fever, and then it went into the lungs. So it actually sounds oddly like it doesn't sound like bubonic plague. It sounds like a virus of the kind with which we're now unpleasantly familiar.
I mean, in Lucretius' account, I thought it sounded a bit like Ebola. I mean, the kind of blood coming from the eyes, and it's really
the tongue, with the blood of the tongue is strange. Yes,
and I wonder whether, I mean, it always seems to me the fact that it ends with that, whether perhaps Lucretius is almost overwhelmed by it. Do you think that the sense that the philosophy that he's articulating, is he feeling that perhaps he's testing it against the worst that he can think of, and does it stand proof against it?
I think testing is exactly right, and it is as you suggest. I mean, lots of people, you're a classicist, and lots of classicists have speculated over centuries that the poem was unfinished, that he couldn't possibly have meant to end it that way, because it seems to break suddenly without consoling words at the end. There's nothing, and so we see that if you follow Epicurus, you'll be calm through all of this. It is on the other hand, it's an account of what it's like to be at the hotspot, at the epicenter of the epidemic, and it just ends.
I mean, it's brutally honest, isn't it?
I think he was not overwhelmed, but I think he was testing the extreme limit of his philosophy. It turns out to be rather easy to be an Epicurean if you...
Oh, I think we've lost Stephen there, have we?
Your circumstances are very comfortable, and wealth and security, then it's actually easy to embrace Epicureanism. It's when things are bad that a philosophy that says pleasure is the highest good. What kind of pleasure is there? So that's the question. What kind of pleasure? And it's a question you, judging from your pleasant-looking library, and I, in my life too, I'm reasonably comfortable in the midst of this hideous thing. But there is, even for us, a question of what pleasure is there in this life.
Now, it would be remiss of me not to move on to Shakespeare, bearing in mind who you are. And I wonder, so Lucretius is drawing his account from Thucydides, who is a contemporary of Sophocles and Euripides writing in the golden age of Athenian tragedy. And then, of course, Lucretius, the reason that you're interested in it, I guess, above all, is that he becomes a great influence on the Renaissance and on kind of emerging theories of materialism. And Shakespeare, of course, also is living against the backdrop of plague, and the Elizabethan Jacobean theatre is another of the golden ages of tragedy. Do you think, is that simply coincidence that both in Athens and in Tudor and Jacobean London, you have this backdrop of plague? I wonder, am I pushing too far there?
I think it's the case that at least for us, looking back on it from the 21st century, now I actually have been thinking about it in slightly different terms because of COVID-19. But I've always found myself wondering, how is it that someone like Shakespeare or Marlowe, any of his, Ben Jonson, all of his contemporaries who lived in these unspeakably unpleasant times by our standards, how did they write beautiful love poetry? How did they celebrate the spring? How did they, in this case, this is a world not only with plague, but in which there was enormous infant mortality. There was nothing basically you could do if you had a toothache except try to knock it out and maybe drink heavily. I mean, and so from our perspective, my perspective, it sometimes looks unbelievable that they were able to get so much deep pleasure from life. You wonder how they did it. And our current woes concentrate the mind because, look, here's a passage. I was thinking, I looked up various moments in which Shakespeare refers to plague, and there are some obvious ones. Plays like Timon of Athens and Coriolanus are full of issues of plague. But this is from Twelfth Night, when Olivia falls in love with, she thinks it's a male servant, Cesario, but it's actually Viola in disguise. If you remember the plot, we don't have to deal with the plot, but she's falling in love with this, what she thinks is a very, very handsome young man. And she says to herself, how now? Even so quickly may one catch the plague? Methinks I feel this youth's perfections with an invisible and subtle stealth to creep in at mine eyes. Well, let it be. So I thought to myself, how is it possible? How is it possible? I understand how it's possible, as we started by doing, to wring one's hands and say, woe is me, in a time like this. But how is it possible to treat this unspeakable thing? 1/5 of the population of London died in 1603, 1604. In most years in Shakespeare's career, incredible numbers of people died. How is it possible to make fun of the plague or to make a metaphor out of it, of falling in love suddenly with a handsome young man? That takes a kind of, how should we say, Epicurean strength. I mean, the kind of Lucretius, but I think it comes from grappling with the same issues.
I mean, the idea that summer's lease hath all too short a stay is a kind of mainstay of Elizabethan literature, really, isn't it? And I mean, it's so much so that it can seem almost a cliche. But I wonder whether, for you personally, as someone who has been reading about it and reflecting on it for so long and to such effect, has the experience of COVID actually given you a sharper appreciation of that? Has it kind of cut through the sense that this might just be cliche?
Well, it as I say, and particularly because it comes after, I mean, it comes after everyone, but the COVID-19 has a special appetite for old guys like me. So I get that summer's lease has all too short a date. And I knew that anyway, even without COVID-19. As my beard began to get wider and wider. What I take in about this period much more powerfully than I ever did before is what it meant to write these plays in the midst of plague. They had cycles of what we would call social isolation. They would have lockdowns in effect. And then as with us, when the economy made it intolerable, unbearable, you couldn't possibly stay in isolation any longer, they let people out, and of course, the plague came back, and then they went into the isolation again. And Shakespeare, I knew this as a fact, but I never took in what it meant to write these plays in these circumstances. I went back and looked. There's a book by a scholar named Leeds Barrell, a Shakespeare scholar, who compiled the figures for closings for plays. Between 1603 and 1611, that's the great bulk of Shakespeare's career, the London playhouses were only open for 40 of the 108 months. And from 1606 to 1610, they were open for about 9 months for those 4.5 years. The rest of the time they were closed because of plague, because of the desperate attempt at getting some control of what they understood that the plague was intensified when large numbers of people gathered together. So what we see is that in the very small intervals between these spikes of plague, when they finally flattened the curve, as we would say, Shakespeare rushed forward with Macbeth and King Lear. Imagine. It's incredible.
The sense, I mean, the thing very, very clear now for anyone involved in the creative arts, for sport, for restaurants, bars, pubs, whatever, anything that you know, for the past my lifetime, people have completely taken for granted that you can go out and you can enjoy these things, and now you can't. And so the prospect of going back and enjoying them becomes almost fierce, and the pleasure probably that we will all take in them will be something fierce.
Exactly. I feel totally that.
You know, great scholar that you are, is this something that is now sharper for you, understanding that, what it must have been like for Shakespeare to want to be able to get out there, to get on the stage? You know, this is income as well as artistic creativity. Yeah. How fiercely he must have used the opportunities.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, that I feel this intensely, as I say now, of what it meant for a spring to be tight, and then explode. And I didn't entirely believe, I confess, when I read the accounts of the closings before, that it would work this way. But I do think now that what happened I thought, as most Shakespeareans did, that in the interval when the theaters were shut down because of plague, Shakespeare wrote, turned away from the theater and wrote his long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, Rape of Lucretius, which are also fascinating and wonderful, which he did write during plague time. But I think he must also have been writing these plays, which he then released with this extraordinary force when the theaters finally came back open. And I agree, I can't wait, even for things that I can't say that I dream at night. Could I get back into the classroom, suddenly I feel the pleasure of just being in a room with 80 or 90 students, the sheer energy that comes from that. I sort of got it, but I never really took in what a delight it is. What a delight it is to walk in the streets with other people, or to go into a crowded store. And you and I were in Jaipur.
Yeah.
Now it seems like another universe, for the Jaipur Literature Festival in January. And I think back at the sheer mass of people crowding into the Jaipur Literature Festival with an enormous pleasure of recollection and nostalgia. And one last thing to return us to Lucretius. Lucretius and Epicurus thought one way of dealing with the crisis that we're in is through the pleasure of memory, through remembering how many wonderful times we've had, and also looking forward to the future when we might have them again. That's actually therapeutic. And it's good to think of exactly as you're describing, of that delight.
I mean, I was thinking about Oedipus, written against a backdrop of plague by Sophocles. And of course, now the plague seems the most significant thing about the whole play, in a way. And I feel a much more kind of intense sense of how and why Sophocles must have written that. Do you have a similar response to any of Shakespeare's plays? Are you seeing them in a new way, with a new intensity for that, in this kind of similar manner?
I mean, in a curious way, there's no moment, I mean, certainly no moment in Shakespeare that I can think of that's like what you're just alluding to, which is that basically Oedipus, who's ruling Thebes, discovers that he is COVID-19.
Yes.
He thinks he's fighting it, but that's what he finds that he is, and that he has to sort of deal with that hideous discovery. I think Shakespeare didn't, I think in some ways it's liberating that Shakespeare didn't think that way, that he didn't think that the gods were punishing England for something they had done. Actually, the people who thought that were 10 people who wanted to shut the theater down, who thought that God was punishing London because they had the theater with boys playing women's parts and so forth.
But it does feel a bit like we're flies to wanton boys, I suppose.
But I think that the most striking version of what of Shakespeare thinking about responding to the plague, other than stoically, well, there are several. One is Timon of Athens, but Timon of Athens thinks, you know what Timon of Athens says? You know what the plague is? Money. Money is the plague. Timon digs up all of his gold and says, here it is, here's the plague. And I hope it's a planetary plague, he says. A planetary plague, extraordinary. He doesn't have the word global pandemic, but that's a good description of gold. So that's the kind of moralizing of the plague, but by way of money.
So coming off the back of that, we're getting some questions in, and we've got a question from Aaron. And Aaron asks, why is it that despite humanity facing several pandemics, we're still vulnerable to anxiety?
Well, I mean,
I guess.
Yes, I mean, from my first response is that it's probably an evolutionary gift. It's a painful gift, but it's like why is it that after humans have burned themselves so many times, it still hurts like hell when you burn yourself? Well, because we know that for the tiny number of people who don't feel the pain when they burn themselves, that's extremely dangerous. So that my assumption is that some of the anxiety, in any case, is given to us as part of our evolutionary heritage in a good way. But to go back to Epicurus and Lucretius, the question is how to get control of that anxiety and use it usefully, ultimately turning it into the possibility of calm, ataraxia, pleasure.
Or perhaps great literature, because we've got another question from Aditi, who says, isn't it that our best works come not from comfortable circumstances, but from the desire to overcome? Which I guess is a kind of backdrop idea to a lot of what we've been talking about.
Yes, it's true. I mean, one would prefer to take this, as we started also by saying, one prefers to take this, as it were, at one remove in literature rather than in life. But I agree with Aditi that much of the literature that we care about comes by plunging into the dark places. And as you said, Tom, as we were saying about the late 16th, early 17th century, or as one can think in different terms, in terms of political circumstances in Russia, let's say, in the 19th and 20th century, the darkness, the horror all around people seem to have brought forth astonishing literary masterpieces.
And I suppose
I wouldn't welcome any of it for the sake of literary masterpieces, but I get it. The point is well taken.
But and I suppose also that it's not just that it produces Oedipus or King Lear, but it also in the case of Shakespeare, it produces Aristophanes and it produces Twelfth Night. So perhaps it's in the darkness that you most treasure the memories of joy and comedy and happiness. I
love the fact that, I mean, I was asked to record a little piece of Shakespeare for a blog, and I didn't really give it much thought. It was like the old people looking through the Bible or looking through Virgil and trying to pick a passage. And I chose, without thinking about it, the two wonderful songs at the end of Love's Labour's Lost about the spring and the winter. I mean, Greasy Joan doth keel the pot. Pure fun, delicious evocation of seasons. And I do think it goes back to what you said about the pub, of just and in this case, pleasures that we don't have to wait for the pub to open. We can look out the window at least, or have a walk. And at the moment where I am, there are the first signs of spring, and it's extremely beautiful.
Okay, well, this again leads brilliantly onto our next question, which has come from Sachdev Ramakrishna, who says, Professor Greenblatt, you spoke of the pleasure of memory. Do you have any ideas how to find pleasure in solitude for social beings such as humans are?
Well, I don't know.
I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the case for the questioner, but I have been very struck by the fact that I'm in touch with people now that I haven't been in touch with for years. I've had long Zoom conversations with people I hadn't given much thought about, and now I feel extremely warmly toward. So we're fortunate. This doesn't answer what happened before the existence of the existence of the social of our digital media. But I'm struck by I spent years lamenting these wretched devices because it seems to me that they destroy our capacity to read. They've ruined my children's this and that, and so forth and so on. I constantly lamenting them. But I'm thrilled that we have this available to us, because I'm talking to friends now for hours at a time in a way that, as a social being, in a way that when I actually can go out and about in the world, I rarely do. And I do think it's a compensation.
This is an interesting question, which doesn't, I suppose, really touch on Lucretius or Shakespeare. But from your point of view as an American, I think this is an interesting question, and it's from Geeta Lima Dutta, who asks that, according to recent medical data, we see that the number of deaths due to malaria, abortions, traffic accidents outnumber COVID-19 deaths. In other words, are we perhaps overemphasizing the impact of the pandemic? Are the responses not actually leading to worse? We're ignoring people dying from other diseases and things. And I guess that is a kind of subtext to quite a lot of opinion in the United States, particularly.
I do think that, not in the United States, but or at least not as much in the United States, but I do think that the reports about famine, particularly in Africa, that may be intensified and caused by the disruption of the food supplies because of the economic shutdowns. I think we do have to weigh enormously seriously whether the cost of trying to control the disease by quarantine and lockdown justifies that kind of loss. Of course, I take seriously, and I understand the political implications too, of the enormous, unimaginably large economic losses in the world. And I do think that, of course, we have to find a way out of, we can't simply stay locked in our houses forever. But I think that the answer isn't simply to shrug and accept more and more and more deaths. The answer is to, as our country has been shamefully inadequate in doing, to organize ourselves for testing and tracing in vast numbers, vastly greater numbers. The United States is a disgrace. It's inexcusable. And the virus, the pandemic, has revealed structural failings that we've known about but haven't done anything about because we've been fat and rich and also had ridiculous government. But now it's time to take it seriously.
I feel your pain. We have identical problem.
My pain is only at the surface. It's rage that I feel, actually, to tell you the truth. And I'm not about to inject myself with Lysol, as yeah. Our president seems to suggest.
Yes. And this is I guess this is a good question with which to conclude our session, and it's from Devarshi Modi. And the question is there some light on the change in the literature you see written during the time of pandemic, which I guess means, is there perhaps a distinctive quality across the centuries, across the millennia, to the kind of literature that gets written during a period of pandemic? Is there something that joins Thucydides and Lucretius and Shakespeare and Boccaccio and Defoe, Camus perhaps? Is there something that joins them all, or is that not the case?
I don't think. I think it would be a mistake from my perspective to think that there's a single strand that will come from all of these very, very diverse responses to Camus' political response, basically, or using the plague as a kind of metaphor for political rot in his country. That seems very different to me from even from the Coriolanus, and Shakespeare has moments in Coriolanus and Timon of Athens of doing that, but it's not the only response, and it's certainly not the principal response that I think that Lucretius had or Thucydides had. There is a political side. All of these writers understand, including Defoe, that there's a political side to this, but the political side cannot be treated as the only aspect of this. There's a side that has to do with what's inside us. How do we deal with putting, as I say, quieting for the moment my rage at my own country's ridiculous government or shameful government with blood on its hands, quieting that, which is the Camus side. There's the other side that has to do with, what do I have inside me? What do you have inside you that enables you to get control of the anxiety that one of your questioners asked you, to use your feelings productively, to understand that this is the only life that you have, even right now, and that you have to figure out ways in which you can take the pleasures, the deep pleasures in the Epicurean sense, the profound pleasures, the pleasures of just being alive from this moment.
Do you think? I mean, something that I've experienced. I went for a long walk very early on Easter Sunday, so when London was completely dead, and it felt like walking through the zombie film 28 Days Later, and then it felt like walking through the Martian invasion in the War of the Worlds. And I began thinking, one of the strange things about this whole experience is that it feels that it's already been written for us, that we're kind of living within fictions that have already been constructed. Is that something that you feel?
I completely see what you're saying. I've had the same eerie feeling. Or Cormac McCarthy's The Road, or other, I mean, to take a particularly ghastly example. But I do think, without being trivial about it, I want to hold on to something we said earlier in this interview, that we have to remember that Midsummer Night's Dream, which is also about a walk in the woods, or Twelfth Night, were also written in the middle of this set of experiences. So it isn't. I can't advise you or make myself feel exactly lighthearted at a moment in which we are globally in this kind of disaster. But I can think that my determination to help, insofar as I can help, politically or in any other way, has to be bound up also with feeling alive, feeling fully alive, not feeling like I'm in a zombie film.
Right.
But
Stephen, that is the perfect note, optimistic note on which to end. We mustn't feel like we're in a zombie film. And on that note, I'm very happy to thank you. Always a privilege to hear from you, and especially at a time like this.
Such a pleasure. Thank you. Such a pleasure to be in touch with you again, and to all of the people who have asked questions and have been watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Tom, for that wonderful session. And thank you all for watching and being part of a great audience for our season of JLF Brave New World Redux. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we'll log back again at 8:30 p.m. for our next JLF Brave New World Season 1 Redux session. Peter Carey, A Life in Writing, in conversation with Chandrahas Chaudhary. See you at 8:30.